Now, one of the first things I always need to point out is to use a good tape measure, one that doesn't have an extension beyond the first number. And we often use the retractable ones, but of course when you're measuring a patient that you do need to worry about infection control, you would probably be using the paper tape measures that are disposable. But in this instance, I'll show you on a normal tape measure. And the other thing that we recommend is that you also use an eyeliner, because you'll find that it's helpful to mark the body where you plan to measure, and also then you can go back and see where you have measured. So I'll go through the process of measuring the upper body first, and although it's all drawn on this sheet, I realise that people may find it baffling, and that's why I'm going through the process trying to make a helpful method of measuring the body. And obviously each thing may be a bit more difficult in the clinical situation, but I'm hoping that this will be helpful. I tend to look at it as measuring all the circumferences of the central torso. And I would start at the neck and then measure each one, leaving a mark. As you see, this mannequin is already marked as we go down. And these measurements will apply to measuring a man, a child, and then we'll come back later to the specifics of measuring a woman's breasts. So while we're just thinking of it in the basic measuring a male or a female or a child, we'll just go through the steps in order. And each measurement that you see on this sheet, although they look like straight lines, they will be circumferential. And then we will need the measurements between them to construct the pattern, which is why if we've left a mark, we can then go back for the distances. So my first measurement is logically the neck. Now, generally it's easier for a patient to stand so that you can get the tape measure around them. There are times when you have to measure them lying down, there are times when you have to measure them sitting down, but people tend to crunch up when they're sitting and you tend to get different distances. So if possible, and to try and make it as short as possible for a patient to stand, because if they're injured they do find it difficult, but then you're able to get a better measurement. So the first measurement would be around the neck, and generally try and pull, or at least place, the tape measure where you're going to be able to read it easily, so you're not actually dragging the tape measure on the skin. So you place it where you can actually measure. And in this instance, you'll notice I'm measuring the neck at what is probably a higher point than you would expect. You might think I would be measuring it on the collarbone because that is where the vest is actually going to sit, but this is why I'm actually showing you that measuring it on the neck and then the garment being under tension, it actually pulls down into the right position because the garment is elasticated. And what we do is we want to know the minimum that neck could be, and we don't make any reduction on the calculations for the pattern, and therefore it's pulled down. Now you'll notice I also have 3 marks on this elastic, because when I've measured that distance, I don't reduce it, but I divide it by 3. And the reason is, you'll see that one measurement, 1/3 is usually the back of the neck, and the other 2/3 form the neckline from side to side. And I just find that that's the easiest way to explain it. When you're measuring, you're not actually bringing the tape measure right down on the collarbone, because if you do, we'll end up with a neckline that stretches as the garment is under tension, far too far down. And this mannequin is actually damaged in an area where many children are burned and many patients are injured that require pressure garments, and it's actually the hardest place to achieve the pressure, but a high neckline and shoulders is essential to get the contact and the covering across that area. So that's why measuring the neckline high is the first thing I need to mention and discuss and explain. To take the axilla measurement, you ask the patient to raise their arms and you pass the tape measure around the chest, right below the armpits, making sure that the end of the tape measure is where you're going to be able to see it. And then you ask the patient to lower their arms again so that the tape measure shows just where the armpit needs to be. And then while the tape measure is still on the patient, you take the eyeliner and mark just above the center of the tape measure, right below the center of the neckline. And then you also measure either side below the side of the neckline. These marks will show you where to measure from the center of the neckline to that axilla mark for the center of the neck measurement, and from the sides of the neckline to that mark for the two distances that are vital for making a vest pattern. Then you can move on to the next line, and whether it's a child or a man, you can usually go straight across the nipples, but on a female it is harder. So you just make that mark on the man or the child as to just where you've gone across. On a woman you would make the mark that is just where the breast drops away, and then you'd record the measurement, and again you'd have left the mark. The next line, which is under a woman's breast or on a man under his breast, if you can see a breast, across the rib cage, you once again would make a mark and record the measurement on the paper. And then you'd probably have to decide just how far you were going with this garment, how far you needed to go, and you might mark your datum point. It's much harder, of course, on this mannequin, but you notice that that datum point is easy enough. It's the natural waistline, and it is the one just above the navel, which you'll probably look at quite carefully on this piece of paper. And if you mark that position and record the measurement, you can then decide how many divisions you want between there and there. And in this case, we have 2 divisions, and so I would halve that measurement, which at the moment is 16, and so I would decide it was 8. Now on a child it wouldn't be 16, it would probably be 10, and then you'd have 5 and 5. And then I would measure, as you imagine, without knocking the model over, on that measurement. Now that would be, if I am beyond the scar adequately, that would be a good place to stop, because it is the natural waistline, and it would grip, in this case with the woman's waist being significantly less than elsewhere, it would grip. Whereas if we needed to go further, we would have to travel further down and once again decide where it ended, make the marks and measure on those marks. But once you're going further out, you're going to flare for the hips, and you may well have the garment lifting, although of course that's when we put a silicone elastic on to grip. But in each case, once you've done the circumferential measurement, starting logically at the neck and working down, you then go back and do the distances between each of those horizontal lines. At this stage you may be able to say to the patient they could sit down, because then you would start working on the arms. And with the arms, as is shown on the measuring form, you would take a diagonal, which would be the line of the raglan of the sleeve, and you'd take the tape measure diagonally, being aware that pulling a tape measure in someone's armpit can be uncomfortable. But that would be to that point that we can envisage the neckline would naturally sit, a neckline of a vest. Not quite where we measured and not quite where we measured, but that's where it will drop to and sit in order to give coverage of shoulders and chest and axilla when you're treating those areas. So that would be your diagonal, and then this would be the measurement right over the top of the sleeve, the top of the shoulder, as is measured there and written into that box. And now this one is where you start travelling down the arm, and that would be from that very same point, and it would be horizontal. Now it's a little hard on this lady because she is slippery, but I would mark that and record the circumferential measurement, and then I would record the next circumferential measurement. And with the arm at right angles as she has it, you can see that it wouldn't travel onto the apex of the elbow, so I would mark there, and then I would divide that distance, which is 18, and if we're going to use all the boxes, you'd see that I would probably use 3 of those boxes, because we're not quite on the elbow, we're actually where the elbow creases. So I would divide that 18 quite comfortably into 3 lots of 6. And then, having recorded the total distance on there, well, actually I'm going to record 666 because we haven't actually got the total distance. The total distance is actually going to be from there to the elbow, which is actually 24, conveniently another 6. So we've got 6, 6, 6 and 6. Then I would measure each of these circumferential measurements as if we were taking a cross section through the arm, and I'd record each of those, and then I would have to record the elbow. Now once again, when we're travelling down the forearm, if we are taking the garment down, I would then take another mark from there and realise I was heading for the wrist, and take another mark at the wrist. As well as recording those circumferential measurements, I've now conveniently got 20, and I will go quite comfortably into 4 lots of 5. And then whichever direction we're now heading, if I keep heading down the arm, I would measure each of those, as you can see, and I would record that I had got 5, 5, 5, 5, and then of course I've got this distance, which conveniently is another 5. And we'd have to be aware that when the arm does fully open, it needs that distance, but it also needs, if you're not going beyond there, the sleeve would need to end there, or if you were only doing a short arm sleeve, it would need to end there. But if you're going the whole length, you need that elbow measurement and those distances. It needs to be pointed out that although we may be finishing the garment at the wrist, which measures 14, we do need to get the hand through that sleeve all the way down, and it's usually important for the pattern maker to know the width of the hand. Now it would be the hand including the thumb, so it's not the normal measurement you take for a glove, it would be that entire hand, which is 23, whereas without my thumb I probably measure about 20, but I have to take my thumb through that sleeve which goes back down to 14 would have to open up with the zip so that the hand can travel through the sleeve and then be closed back down to be snug at the wrist in order to anchor the sleeve so it doesn't slide around and gives tension to whatever area of the injury you're treating.